Hello and welcome to episode 53 of The Garden Log with me, Ben Dark. I am a gardener and this is emphatically a gardening podcast. This week we are talking about the cruel damage done by our northern winter to some tender Taiwanese plants of my acquaintance. We're talking about some horrendous bothering that I've been doing, very bad practice. We're talking about a little bit of lawn meditation, lawn fiddling, just lawn harassment really, playing around with that green carpet, and also recommending a fantastic documentary featuring my absolute favourite man, Ian Nairn. If any of that interests you, then I recommend you stick around. Right, enough of the introductions. Let's get on with the week in gardening. Welcome to the week in gardening. We started this week soaked through to our metaphorical bedrock, gardeners and garden both. The week before had been one long litany of wet and wetting behaviour. And so it was nice to be granted a reprieve this week. It was one of those rare time-travelling weeks, one of those weeks that could have come from a generally clement April, and somehow found itself wandering around the latter half of February. Mondays at this time of year are particularly good for proving to oneself that things are changing and the winter is coming to an end, and particularly Mondays like this one, Mondays that follow an exceptionally dark and lightless week. After Thursday and Friday last week, when we went home with hair plastered to our scalps and the light already fading from the sky, to be jumping on my bicycle at 4 o'clock and cycling down the hill, on the train and into London again with the light still just fading from the sky. I saw the sunset over Hyde Park, which was incredible. You realise that actually things are moving on. The world is tilting gently towards its more hospitable angles. So that was very nice. Soon it's going to be light enough for sunrise as I cycle back through London towards Marylebone Station. It only happens twice a year where the sun lines up perfectly with this church at the end of a road I cycle straight down. It's St Mary's Church, Marylebone, which is this fantastic Regency job with a wonderful exedra at the front with these Doric columns and a big spire, and it lines up perfectly in the centre of the road at dawn. But anyway, that's a very exciting time, not too long away. Everything looks better in the sunshine. The garden looks better in the sun, certainly. So on Monday there was the beautiful sight of the Corsican hellebores out in limey full bloom. They've been going for a while, but they really last at this time of year. And so Monday, it lent itself to wandering around and checking on the casualties, like an indomitable nurse on some battlefield hospital, going around seeing who needed amputation and who needed gently administered overdose. And I found some plants in trouble. Most of them are okay. My icon plant, my obsessional plant of the winter, the Madeira geraniums, seem to be doing all right. They've lost a few leaves to snow squash, the wet effect of having a large snowy lump lying on top of them, but the frosts haven't got them. The frost damage has hit some of the Fatsia polycarpa, the five-finger cultivar, which is from Taiwan, and that probably explains a little bit of its unhappiness. I don't know if anyone has examined the growth points of Fatsias, but they're one of these things that grows from a central point at the end of the stem, and coming from that you get the tiny little leaves, very, very sweet little things that grow up and bigger and bigger and bigger until they're the size of an ogre's outstretched hand. And all of these little ones that were just trying to emerge at the end of last year, the foolish things, they should have waited, but anyway, they tried their best, and they have been blasted by frost and now hang around mummified as reminders of, well, I suppose, of my cruelty in putting them into this garden in England, far, far away from their wonderful tropical home. I'm hoping that these will be pushed aside by new growth once the air is warm and the light levels are high. My only concern is these are young plants, so they haven't formed a bush-like aspect. They are much more in the twig vein. And if their growing point has been significantly damaged by the frost, as opposed to just the new leaves, then we might find ourselves in a little bit of trouble. But then, that's the excitement of gardening, isn't it? If all plants survived, then we wouldn't take pleasure in the ones that did. I will, of course, let you know if they do end up dead. With the sun being out, I was tempted to get out the pedestrian mower and do some light striping on some various bits of lawn. Bits of lawn, the new lawn, the stuff that was laid at the end of last year, when turf companies send out their outdoor carpets, their rolls of skimmed off grass, then they tend to absolutely dose them full of nitrogen. They arrive on site completely drugged to the eyeballs, like roided out super soldiers just willing to grow. And that means that any opportunity, any mild spell over the winter, they've been shooting and growing, and they did a little hair cutting, and things look good with them cut away. And so Monday was spent bringing some order. On Tuesday I took inspiration and decided to tackle some of the larger stretches of lawn, and got out the ride-on lawnmower and drove around on that. The sun was out again, and there is a great pleasure in life on the back of a ride-on mower. I certainly wouldn't want to do it every day, all day, but the sitting down, the starting the engine, putting on your headphones, ear protectors, and then tuning in to Radio 4 or to a good podcast, and just knowing there's nothing that can distract you. You can't stop on your way to another job and pick up something half done or half finished. No one's going to call you off halfway through a stripe and say, have a look at this interesting button I've seen on eBay. They're going to let you carry on going straight up and down and up and down. And there is, I suppose, it's a meditative quality to this. I think this podcast would sound good listened to on a ride-on mower, if any of you are thinking of getting into the mowing business. I let my mind wander. I got very excited at one stage because I thought I saw a grey parrot, an escaped grey parrot, up in one of the trees looking down at me. And I drove towards that with great interest to find it was a faded grey-blue plastic bag, which probably means my mind was slightly understimulated. I had that dark room syndrome where you start seeing all of the trolls that haunted your childhood nights lurking in the corners, except they were parrots in trees. Anyway, that was very exciting. And the afternoon was spent, part of the afternoon was spent with a very long stick trying to pull this plastic bag down out of the tree. And it was disintegrating. I know that David Attenborough tells us that the plastic bags in the ocean do disintegrate into microplastics, but also plastic bags of the tree-dwelling variety are wont to break down into small little plastic bits when poked with a stick. So that was quite exciting. Goodness knows how long it had been up there. I don't know why I hadn't spotted it before. Anyway, that was Tuesday. Wednesday was spent doing some Verge doctoring. I mentioned a few weeks ago that there were some local verges that had been horrendously mistreated by large lorries for which we have some responsibility. And so I went out to make some verges good, heave them back into some semblance of bank. I didn't want to do it earlier because in the very, very wet, you really don't want to play with any soil. I would have been plastering rather than rebuilding it with a good crumb of soil. But I managed to get it back into something like its pre-lorry slope, and then I covered it in with a good couple of handfuls of grass seed, which probably will germinate. Now it's a fairly warm bit of the country, and it's fairly good seed, and it looks like I've done something. That's the main thing. Anyone going past will say, well, goodness, at least they tried to make it good. After that, I did a good day of sun-warmed pottering elsewhere, moving around some variegated dwarf bamboo. I don't know what it is. It predates me and was in very large clumps, but that I hacked down to sort of convict stubble level and split into little chunks and dotted it around in the tropical garden area to provide one of those interesting foliage foils to some of the bananas and the Melianthus majors. It's going to be a repeating pattern, a repeating upright at the back of the garden, and it's going to give that jungle going on forever effect, I hope, by being beams of light, like a tiger uses to blend into something. If the end of this part of the garden blends into the distance with this striped bamboo optical illusion, the human brain can be conned, as we know from my plastic bag parrot experiences, can be conned very easily, which is a lot of what gardening's about. So that was a little bit of a con job, and hopefully it will work. Thursday was another day of glorious sunshine, and I spent it in the British Library up in Bloomsbury, which was fun. It was very fun. I was researching bits and pieces about Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the guy who designed Central Park and lots of the other great American parks. And I was also looking into some of the papers from the old India office. They've got all sorts of papers about the running of the gardens out there, mainly the Calcutta Botanical Garden. And there's lots of interesting planting books and plans. So I was having a little rummage around in that part of the old archives there. It's interesting. It's a complete different fiefdom of the British Library. There are all these warring bits, and then down at the bottom there are all these undergraduates milling around doing homework and flooding the humanities rooms. And as you get into the more obscure and obtuse bits of the library, the tweed jackets get older, and the hair gets thinner, and the personality traits get more ingrained and eccentric. It's very fun. I have really enjoyed working in archives all winter, but there is a slight different feeling when you know that there is glorious sunshine out there, and that plants are leaking wonderful smells into the air, and things are waking up. Then there's a little sense of missing out that makes me think, actually, no, I don't think I will spend my life dedicated to the unearthing of ancient manuscripts. I think I will spend it dedicated to the planting of fragrant shrubs instead. So I went back to that on Friday. No planting, but a lot of going around and smelling things, smelling the wafts. It was a very, very still day, which meant that all the perfume from the Sarcococcas and the other winter flowering things, the daphnes, were clouding around the area like something spilled, like ink or blood in water, and it all just gently wafts around one place, so you could get pockets of it. And there's slight breezes and micro eddies that means you smell a certain plant's strongest fragrance a little bit removed from where it actually is. You smell the Sarcococca, which is planted next to a sculpture of a horse, but you smell it while you're walking past the diagonally opposite bird bath, which is nice. It's a nice little trick that the plants play. It was also tricking and attracting lots of little pollinators. I saw some very happy bumblebees, and also hoverflies were out. 2 species of hoverflies, one medium, one very tiny. Goodness knows how long it would take me to learn the hover species of the British Isles. I've got the vast one down, that giant one that looks like a bee. I can recognise that one. The rest of them are just mysterious members of the hoverfly supporting cast so far. On Friday I was doing things more horticultural. I was replanting this yew hedge that had gone in behind these vast black iron railings we have towards the front of the property. Iron railings that give a Victorian zoo feel to the whole garden. Something that I'm very keen on. Victorian zoological gardens is an underappreciated category of influence in modern garden design, and I had to take the railings down to plant this hedge, which requires socket sets and ladders and hammers and lifting equipment, which makes a mundane job feel very exciting, feel more momentous than it is. And I was going to leave these yews. They were planted in the autumn and had been messed around a little bit by some people doing building work. One of them certainly needed replanting because it was completely skew with, lying drunkenly on an angle with half its root ball indecorously showing, and that needed rebedding in. And while I was at it, I decided that I would lift the whole hedge, which is awful horticultural behaviour because you should leave plants. You really don't want to go messing around with them once they're in. It's like opening the oven door on a soufflé. It just leads to disaster. Let them get on with it. But I lifted the hedge, and I saw that it had started shooting out little roots into its new environment, which obviously now have all been snapped and destroyed, and it must once more start the great journey towards living comfortably in its new position again. So I'm a very bad and interfering gardener, but I did get a straight line that lines up perfectly with the railings that it was designed to back. It really is a game of compromise, this gardening thing. It's not all strictly rule-based, unfortunately. I think they should make a gardening board game where the goal is the glorious open garden for charity, but there are 15 or 20 or 30 different strategies to get there, most of them involving sabotaging neighbouring gardens, but some of them involving messing around with your own. Anyway, that's something for board game developers to think about, not for us. I finished the day on Friday by giving the lawns another little winter feed, a very light half-dose application of a very, very slow-release fertilizer, the equivalent of an incredibly heavy, almost indigestible lunch for the lawn, entirely consisting of hard-boiled eggs that will keep it going until happier times, until the weather improves and we can once more eat little oranges and mandarins. And once that was done and everything was packed away, there was a little frustration on Friday. Just as I wanted to go home, I found that the combination lock on one of the tool sheds had managed to shift itself to a whole new number, and I thought I was going to have to get the bolt cutters, but this is a silly story, you don't need to hear this, sorry. Anyway, if there's nothing horticultural to talk about, let's get on and see if there are any recommendations this week. My recommendation this week is a documentary, an absolutely fantastic documentary that I found on the BBC iPlayer. It's one of the ones they've dug up from their extensive archive and shoved back out there to remind us of what we're missing out on nowadays. This one's from 1969 and it's called The More We Are Together, and it's all about Eric Lyon, the architect, and his work with Span, the property development company, doing all of those wonderful developments around the 60s, those very, very modernist, ultra-landscaped housing areas. And the best thing about it is that the location presenter is Ian Nairn. Ian Nairn is one of my favourite writers about architects. I talked about him on one of the early podcasts about his book Nairn's London, and how brilliantly he writes and how brilliantly he seemed to have lived in various pubs. And he is wandering around judging and then interviews with the people who live in these communities. And these were communities designed to provide a new way of living. It was living that wasn't secluded and private. When they interview Eric Lyons at the beginning, he is leaning back incredibly loosely on a chair and spouting these wonderful words of wisdom. And Lyons talks about modern buildings and the modern obsession with privacy. And he says that, yes, they have privacy, but it's the privacy of a jail. Talking about these individual units of housing that were springing up across post-war suburbia. And he said that his developments, these community-based around the rolling lawns and the birch trees planted in squares, were about giving people options, that they could be a part of a society. He says that you don't have to be a matey neighbour, you don't have to be a gregarious social chap, but also you don't have to make a choice never to be social and never to be a matey kind of pally guy, because some days you want that and some days you don't. And his developments were all set up so you could make that choice daily and get away from this horrible pretense that there's no one living next door to me for miles and miles. In fact, the other chap is 4.5 foot away brushing his teeth. And he's brilliantly persuasive on this subject. He's got a great line in Disparagement. There's this bit where he's addressing the off-screen interviewer, and he says, "I'm for planning, and I suppose you're for planning." And then he gestures, "But I don't suppose either of us has ever seen much of it." And he goes on to justify his new plans, which are against this 4 houses per acre Escher model. Escher is held up as the exemplar of what not to be like. We don't want Escher. And then into this you get the brilliant Ian Nairn, who wanders around quizzically, always looking conflicted and almost tearing at his hair as he gets his thoughts out of his mouth and into the camera. I don't know if it's an act, but if it is, it's a very well done one. And he wanders around and he's completely conflicted and says things like, "What I don't like about this sort of place is that if you're doing something you don't want your neighbours to see, then you're completely stuck. You can't do it with the window open, but if you close the curtains, well, they know you're doing it anyway." And he goes on to develop this into a brilliant argument about the smug, inbred, inward nature of these dwellings. This is from Nairn, who says in the documentary that his idea of home is a very small flat in a very big city with no possessions and the whole of the metropolis to use as his dining and drawing room. And he gets into an argument with one of the householders about where the smugness in the Span homes comes from. Does it come from the householders who bring their own smugness in from the outside? Or is it, as Nairn argues, that Span has given them an extra dimension of smugness that they didn't have before? They didn't know they had. It's a very, very well done and engrossing documentary about architecture. I think we're missing this. I enjoy architectural programs on television, and I like the Kevin MacLeod stuff and the George Clark stuff, and they're nice and they're aspirational, but they don't have the engagement with the argument that this documentary does. They visit both Nairn's house and Eric Lyons' house and are very disparaging about both of them and make horrendous implications about the people. It's a type of programming that I would like to see brought back. It's got a wonderful Handel score, and they've obviously hired sort of scampish urchins to run around whenever they're doing their filming in black and white. But you do see some brilliant landscapes. Some of the landscaping around places like Temple Marsh, where they've brought these magnificent, they built the houses around these magnificent ancient cedars and almost designed the whole scheme around them. It's very clever stuff. You also realise that modern landscaping hasn't changed a great deal. There's lots of these slightly off-axis square beds with silver birch planted and maybe a low stuff of furs or fluff around them, which, were we to switch from black and white to colour, would certainly not look out of place in a Society of Garden Designers magazine or awards show. I don't know how long it will be on iPlayer, and I don't know if you can find it elsewhere. It's on Omnibus Presents. I'm sure if you look for YouTube, Omnibus Presents, The More We Are Together, then you will find it. It's quite timely. There is a little focus on the landscaping of the area, the planting of the trees, and that's something that we're hearing a lot about in the UK at the moment. How planning departments and developers are getting around their obligation to plant trees, citing various means of costs and inconvenience involved in it. And it was interesting to see how these things were going on back then. Of course, also in 1969, it hasn't loomed over the horizon of the documentary, but they don't know it yet. But the Greater London Council is about to default, and the company is going to go bust. So it's quite, that adds a little extra something to watching it. So that's my recommendation for this week. A bit of exciting, uplifting, cantankerous old Ian Nairn. Thank you for listening to the Garden Log this week. We are getting ever closer to spring, though it is still winter. That exciting bit of winter, that winter loaded with promise. My friend Andrew O'Brien is very good on this, on the winter-spring thing, as he hashtags it. And I saw somewhere that his next podcast is going to be all about that, so it's probably worth checking out the next Garden, Weeds and Words episode to get more of that kind of fix. I will be doggedly slogging through the next few weeks, planting things, pruning things, thinking about things, generally carrying on in a very similar manner to the last few years. Anyway, until next time, I hope you have a wonderful week. Whether you are in the garden or not, stay safe, watch out for parrots, and I will see you all here next week. Thank you and goodbye.